So there's a misconception that if you're single, you are incomplete, perhaps damaged, salvaged, and you won't be happy until you find your one. And that is not true. That is bullshit. It is a message that has been fed to us by media and advertising. The truth is, when you're single, you have the richest soil for growth. That's why I created this podcast. And unlike other podcasts, this one is host-driven, not guest-driven. That means I will be rotating health and wellness experts 3 times a week to give you the giant box of wellness crayons, not just the primary colors, so you can start building a meaningful life. It's time to give singlehood a cape.
Hi, MC.
Hi, Paul.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good. Just so the listeners know, MC is my new bestest friend in the dark world of talking about our stuff. MC was one of the instructors, facilitators, teachers for my Lumia days in Essentials and talking about trauma. And this is a topic that is extremely near and dear to me. And considering my own experiences and where I want to work with other people as a coach. And MC has been a fantastic resource and somebody that I am honored to, in the few conversations we have, to have a little apprentice experience. And
thank you.
MC, your bona fides. Tell people what I already know.
Yes. I am a Ph.D. trauma researcher, professor, and life coach. And I am in the space of trauma. So I've been researching trauma since 2009. And I've written, my 3rd book is about to come out in March. And my whole goal of life is to kind of, right as Paul said, is to meet people in the dark. At my first teaching job, they nicknamed me Dr. Sunshine because I was studying grief, mourning, and then trauma. And then, they were like, what's next? So that's a perfect intro.
And I'm just a guy, former corporate creative who had a tremendously visible fall from grace 5 years ago and worked my way back through various modalities, of which coaching was a significant part of that, therapy, plant medicine, delivered cold exposure, a whole bunch of things that brought me to the point where I am today that I'm very proud to say is in the company of people like MC and John Kim. So we're going to talk about, and staying in line with John's book, Single on Purpose,
Mm-hmm.
how you bring our darker angels, our deep dark, our trauma to a new relationship. How do you introduce that? And MC, I'll leave it to you. But we were also going to do an icebreaker too. We're just going to jump into the academic stuff and talking about this. And it looked like you had one loaded for me.
I did.
Oh, okay. All right.
I actually now have a 2-part one because I had one loaded, but then your intro gave me a second one, which is now my first part, which is bumping down what I had already, is why did you call yourself a regular guy?
Well, I mean, you came in hot with like Ph.D. and I'm like, well, okay, I don't have those cards. I got a pair of 6s over here. No, thank you for pointing that out. Just a little forced humility. And so, yeah, you got me on that one.
Cut it out, Paul.
All right.
And
note to everyone listening, don't do it.
Only because this is exactly what John would have done because I have in fact, not that long ago, introduced myself similarly onto his podcast, and he did the exact same thing. So it's just coaching hazing.
Okay. I like that. All right.
Okay.
There was a second part.
When you say bringing your darker angels to relationships, you have something in mind for you. What do you mean? Let's go to the deep dark.
When this year, the conversation that is the most profound, and on New Year's Eve, I'll be thinking about it, was on my own podcast where I came out as a bisexual man.
Mm.
And so before I was married, I made a pact with myself that every time I would start to develop a relationship with a woman, and around second or third date, it was like, okay, here we go. This is who I am. I have had these experiences.
Mm.
That's what I considered my deep dark. That's what I considered my shame.
Mm.
And it it either resulted in, it was pretty binary. It either resulted in somebody going, oh, okay, all right, well, that's interesting. I can roll with that. Or literally somebody picking up their purse and leaving the table.
Mm.
And so it causes it to get deeper. It causes it to get darker. It causes it to get
Yeah.
shame filled and things like that. So I would have loved a conversation like this back then, going, okay, what are the tools? Who can I read?
Mm.
What can I listen
Mm.
to when I'm about to tell somebody something? I mean, I know in several situations through friends that people have to, reveal a medical status or condition
Mm.
or something that they hold a lot of shame around, or, you know, something that happened to them socially. I don't know. I mean, there's all
Mm.
sorts of things that we just like wrap in this disgusting candy shell of shame and
Mm.
and darkness. So that's where I lean on you for that, is like, okay, how do we do that on the second and third date, going, okay, this is what I got.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking that you even had to be in that headspace to think about that, right? Is this going to happen? And then it sounds like you had the negative reinforcement of your worst fear actually coming true,
Hmm. Yeah, I did.
where you're
I
like,
did
no,
several times. Yeah.
yeah, like I
Yeah.
should be ashamed, which is completely false.
Yeah. And in all fairness, I've had situations put on me where I've had to make the call and go, yeah, I can't go through with this. It
Mm.
was, I remember in my 20s, there was a young lady that her dad had a significant criminal record,
Mm.
and there was still residue, pouring over. So that was going to be an investment on my part. And I
Right.
had to think about it and go, okay, I can't take this on. And it's always kind of
Mm.
haunted me. I'm like, well, that was that compassionate, wow,
Mm.
nice guy. But yeah, no, I went for the door myself.
And that's such a thank you for sharing that piece, because I think that's such a that's the missing piece, is that we are all potentially in that position where you're sitting across the table thinking, I don't know if I can deal with this. And then what, right? Is there a compassionate way to, express that, to draw that boundary without shaming the other person, you know?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
believe there is, but if we don't talk about it, then we can't get there.
What is the way that you, slide that cocktail napkin across the table
I
and
mean,
bring it out? I mean, there's no hard fast rules. There's nothing. It's just based on each situation.
yeah. So, I mean, I think, sometimes I worry about in the current sort of minefield of culture that we're living in right now. It's helpful to remind ourselves that it's okay to have preferences and lines. You don't
Hmm.
have to stay with somebody if you're uncomfortable with something that's not going to, that is not going to work for you. So in your situation, you're going to encounter people that are not comfortable being in a relationship with someone who's bisexual. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they should like push against that and conquer it, right?
Yeah.
But they can handle it with care. And the same in the situation with, the woman that you mentioned, where you're like, wow, this is kind of a deal breaker. This goes against my values. Um, how can I push against this in a way that doesn't shame her?
Yeah. And I mean, the rocks lying out in the horizon on that, if you try to muscle through it, is
Mhm. Right.
resentment
Right.
and contempt
Exactly.
and all that
Right.
stuff that they
Hmm.
put you in this spot.
Mm.
Um, so it's not even a fact of, it's really self-examination. It's like, what are you,
Yep.
like you said, what are your lines?
Right. And how do you
And even,
communicate them without making the other person feel like their thing is in a disgusting candy shell, as you said?
yeah. I- And you also may not even know your lines until you're forced to step up to them
Yeah.
too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And I
Yeah.
imagine that was probably the case with with the woman you mentioned, right? You probably had
Yeah,
never thought of that.
I'd never thought about it. I'd never even, even the crimes that were involved were criminal crimes. They weren't
Mhm.
sex related. They weren't anything that had shame. It was just like, white collar crime. And I'm like,
Mhm.
wow, okay, never thought I'd be here, sitting across, and this young lady, man, what a burden she carries. And the immediate response was compassion. Like I wanted to hold her and say, oh my God, I'm so
Mhm.
sorry that you have to deal with this every day. But and then my head went, can I do this 365
Right,
for an indeterminate amount of time
right,
going
right,
forward? It's like that.
right.
Yeah, that's why I tapped out.
And so I think like when the image that comes to mind is like this, can I dance with this thing, this unexpected thing that just got put onto the table? Can I dance with it?
Hmm.
And if not, then how can I tap out in a way that allows the other person their dignity,
Yeah,
right? Like putting it
that's
into, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
no, no, no. That's a beautiful way of putting it. Is like, that's how you can show compassionate, is to
Yeah.
respect that person's dignity and try to be as upfront and
Hmm.
honest as possible.
And
Because
I
we're
bet
forced
you,
into.
go
No,
ahead.
I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I bet, even knowing you just a little bit that I do, that you didn't pick up your purse and walk away, right? That you
Yeah,
handled it with, even though I can sense like a little shame around it, that you handled it with grace.
yeah. She may, God forbid, she's listening to this and may have a different take on the whole thing. But
Right, right.
yeah, and I think that social media makes it right. It wasn't the case back then,
Hmm.
but I think now we see these acts of unbelievable charity and compassion. And the first thing that comes to mind is the dad who would go, that would be in marathons with the son in the
Yes.
stroller, who I think had MS,
In
and I
in
mean, it's,
Boston. Yes, I can't
yeah.
remember his name, but yep, yep.
So you see that and you're like, well, geez, I mean, what's wrong with me? Why can't I step up to the
Mm-hmm.
plate and, show that kind of, you know, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of peer pressure to be the better person
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's super important to distinguish between, Hoyt is their name. Distinguish between when you're going above and beyond simply to be the virtuous person, and when you're going above and beyond from a place of love, right? Because there are
Yeah.
these stories in relationships where folks are really do have to grapple with something that they would have previously said was a deal breaker, and they decide to do the marathon thing, right? To go above and
Yeah.
beyond, but from a place of love, not from a place of, I'm gonna, oh goody, I'm gonna be able to put this on social media and look like the good guy, you know?
Yeah. So the takeaway is to treat the person with dignity, come in with
Mhm.
compassion, and know your red lines,
Mhm, mhm.
and be
And
able to
dance with them, I think,
end
like,
in.
because we can all like come up with our lists. We love to do this. This is what I need in a relationship. This is what I won't take in a relationship. But when you're actually face to face with another human being with a heart right in front of you, like, ask yourself the question, is this really a preference? Can I dance with this? Is this something that I can entertain
Yeah.
before? Because I think sometimes we cut it off before that's clear.
Yeah. Or force ourselves to expand. And
Yeah, right.
yeah.
And then end up in resentment, which is relationship death for sure.
Yeah. So the kind of the sequel to this is the two people coming that have, as I called
Hmm.
it, competitive scars.
Yeah.
And you and I had an earlier conversations. The whole reason that I wanted to do this was you could speak to, as I called it, and I've heard a lot of people call that, and I would love for this conversation to kind of put it to bed for whoever is listening, is the whole big T, little t trauma kind of thing. And I
Hmm.
said, okay, MC, you can talk about big T trauma, sexual violence, things like that. And
Hmm.
I can do little t trauma, which is just somebody completely falling apart, abusing alcohol, disaffected and
Hmm.
unconnected from everything. And then you corrected me. And I'd love for you to correct me again on that.
Yes. So, big T, little T trauma is one of these distinctions that has gotten sort of like stolen from the clinical world, where it has a purpose and a history, which I can explain in a second, and then just like twisted in social media and all over the internet into something that it isn't. And I wish I actually have a chapter in the book that's just called, the title is "There is no big T, little T trauma," because we know on a neurobiological perspective that the brain and the body do not distinguish between types of trauma. In other words, there's no hierarchy. Your brain's not like, oh, this is just like a minor trauma, I'm going to put it over here, and this is a major trauma. Like, that's not the brain. The brain structures that are responding in the moment are not sophisticated enough to do that. And so we need to understand that whatever the brain experiences as significantly overwhelming to turn on its emergency defense mechanisms is trauma. So we have to stop defining trauma by the type of event. So all that's over here. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, and I was just going to say, I think you put it in one of your recent posts that those reactions are based in strength.
Yes.
It's not based in weakness. It's your body, throwing up this defense mechanism to protect the suit of armor, neurologically to protect you.
Totally, because it has to, because it thinks that you are in mortal danger, and it's not going to differentiate between, your house is on fire and, your partner might leave. It doesn't register.
And this
those
is all
differences.
all amygdala, limbic system, and then frontal cortex is the thing that then tries to process it and then gets scrambled.
Yeah.
Right.
And here's the thing really quickly, that your brain operates like an old house with circuitry that can't be on at the same time. So like in an old house, you have you can't like run your hair dryer and your microwave at the same time, or the fuse blows. The same thing happens in your brain. So when your amygdala, which is the alarm system, right, the fire alarm, is taking up tons of energy, it pulls that energy away from the prefrontal cortex and a bunch of other brain structures, the hippocampus, other things, which means that your rational processing isn't really online. And so there isn't a discussion where your prefrontal cortex is able to say, hey, it's just an argument with your partner. It's probably going to be okay. Let's give it a couple days and we'll figure out a way out, right? Your prefrontal cortex is not online. And so all you are is alarm.
Yeah.
So
yeah. That takes us to, let's just set up a scenario. It's like two people been dating, fresh relationship. One is a survivor of sexual abuse from childhood. The other one has had a mom who did white wine too much 4 nights a week for their entire life. And one, death by 1,000 cuts, and one was a moment seared in time. And we've just determined that there's no difference once you get down to that cellular level and that neurological level. And so that competitive scar thing, it's like, well, okay, yeah, that's great, but your mom's still alive and this is that, and and she just drank too much, big deal, look at me, or vice versa. Is that common?
So common. This is what I see probably the most often in couples. There's like a couple of themes that come out when I work with couples, and this is one of the most common ones. And then, so just to like, also, by the way, I love the moment seared in time. I'm going to be thinking about that all day, just that language that you used, because that is what it's like, right? It's like you throw the steak on the super hot stove and then there's that skin. So when Francine Shapiro, who's the founder of EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a very, has gotten a lot bigger. It's a common modality to work with trauma. When she was developing and writing her textbook on trauma, that modality was designed for what we call big T traumas, which are, the moment seared in time, that one instance of sexual abuse that's very distinct. And the way that EMDR works is that it's sort of manual manipulation of your prefrontal cortex so that you can process the trauma that you didn't get to process in the moment. And it uses bilateral stimulation to do that. So it kind of forces your prefrontal cortex online so you can process what didn't get processed. So she developed that modality. They were using it really successfully for these capital T traumas, these kind of singular events that were widely recognized clinically as traumatic. In her textbook, she was like, hey, I think we should try this for the things that aren't labeled trauma by clinicians, like bullying. Because at the time when she was writing, the definition of trauma in the clinical world was anything that lied outside the norm. And so sexual assault, we thought at the time, was outside the norm. Bullying, on the other hand, in grade school, was well within the norm. And so they weren't using EMDR to work with those kinds of things. But she was like, look, I feel like the symptoms are the same, and I think this modality would work. So she was trying to say that capital T and lowercase t traumas are the same, and that EMDR would work similarly, which it does. And for some reason that got twisted into this big T traumas are legitimate and lowercase t traumas are lesser. And that's wrong on every level. It's wrong from the clinical level. It's wrong from the neurobiological level. It's just not true. But then what happens is, because we have that societal narrative, I'll have a couple that comes in, and it's actually usually kind of the other way, where it's like the person who had neglect, which is what you're describing when you're saying like mom is a box and a half of wine in by 7 p.m. That's neglect and out of control. That's substance abuse in the home. That person will say, my trauma is not real because it's lowercase t. She never hit me. I didn't have sexual assault. My partner's trauma is real. And they're using that to shame themselves, which gets in the way of healing. And it also does happen the other way, as you mentioned, where the person will say, well, I have capital T trauma. I have a sexual assault. This person just has, their mom was still alive. What's your problem? You can work it out with them. And it's just like, could we not, right? Like, could we not create that hierarchy and compare traumas? Could we come together and say, my trauma is different than yours, but we both know what it's like to feel trapped and out of control. And how is that then taking hold in the way that we are in relationship to one another? And how is that potentially a problem? And how can we avoid those pitfalls and also potentially heal? Because the thing about trauma is that there's this double-edged sword, or catch-22, I'm not sure the best phrase, is that we are harmed by other people and healed by other people.
Wow. And so the key is recognizing that pathology is two people coming together going, look, same currency, same monetary exchange here.
Yes.
Let's get a third party to
I love that. Yep.
So to sort this out.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's really the most effective way, is just getting a third party, getting a therapist that understands and that there is no distinction.
Right.
Yeah.
And to figure out who can kind of suss out, like, okay, here's where the trigger is, here's what's behind it, here's how you're taking that out on your partner. And then again, like, I didn't mean to do this, but this idea of like dancing with it. How do we dance with it? How do we, if these are the things that are present, how do we navigate,
bringing my personal experience into this, and I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to do one of these on ayahuasca and plant medicine.
Yeah.
I did three ceremonies, and each journey, there was always this lingering presence going, yeah, this is great. You're doing some great work, but until you deal with this, really doesn't matter. There was always that feeling. And I'll never forget the last ceremony that I did. They all seemed to be like a trilogy, like all these episodes working up to this finale was this incredibly horrible and painful ceremony. I was just a wreck. Almost dehydrated. And I remember begging that whatever was going on in my head, okay, fine, please show me the relative that touched me incorrectly. What is this blockage? And that's where my mind went. And then when I asked that question, I got this feeling of, no, this is nothing big. It was just death by 1,000 cuts. You had a rough childhood. You were bullied. You had this, you had that. This came in. And then it was like, okay, let the child sleep. Fine.
Oh,
Let
yeah.
the, and that's when I felt the peace. But but I was struck by the fact that in order for me to kind of like be let out of jail, I went to the big T trauma. I'm like, okay, well,
Yeah.
there's got to be something huge here. There's got to be something revelatory that's coming around the corner. I can take it, hit me with it.
Hmm.
And it never did. It
Hmm.
was just the little T trauma. But man, it stuck. It burned just like everything
Yeah.
else. So yeah, that's what really made me cognizant of this differentiation and kind of how this has just been thrown around.
I'm so glad you are sharing that story because I've had so many clients kind of similarly, not so many clients. I've had a handful of clients have kind of a rough go with plant medicine because they're going into it with that framework
Yeah.
of I have to find, we have this like misconception that we've got to go digging for what was the big legitimate thing that made me broken.
Yeah.
And there's two things wrong with that, right? Like number one, it was probably death by a thousand cuts, which you're then going to have shame about to peel away. And then the other thing is that you're not broken.
Yeah.
And so you're coming into that inquiry with judgment, which makes it stop being an inquiry at all.
Yeah. I call it this aspirational bias. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to do this. Let's go this. I'm electing to go to the deep dark. So show me.
Right.
And then you read, and then there's all these anecdotal stories of people coming out the other side. Like, oh my God,
Hmm.
they sat in their own sick for 2 days and then came out reborn, which is
Hmm.
purely apocryphal and almost mythological because the work begins with integration after
Yes.
the
Yes.
ceremony.
Yes.
So it has nothing to do with the plant medicine other than the fact that that is just a facilitator and just kind of the communal
Mm.
experience. But man, did your balls get busted, week 2 on a subway or in a commute to work where it comes
Hmm.
back and you're like, okay, I need to work through this. And that's where you need somebody who specializes in plant medicine integration.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I'm
So
so glad you're saying that. I think that we need to shout that from the rooftops and put it on a billboard because if you just go do the ceremony, right, then you don't have any scaffolding underneath you to
you
do
don't.
that processing and integration, which is the goal, as you said. And that's the goal of trauma healing is integration.
Yeah, it's not just one therapy. It's not just a Tuesday at 3 p.m. with your therapist and then you're okay.
Right. Right.
It's the
Right. Right.
stuff after
Right.
that. So that leads to, is there, I want to establish the differentiation between trauma and shame. Are they two different
Yeah.
things? Do they get conflated? Do they get rubbed up against each other and come out the same way? Or is there a
Mhm.
pure distinction?
I don't know if this is going to make sense because it's just coming to mind and I've literally never thought about it until right now. But Captain America, right?
Yeah.
Super strong. Captain America. He's just, I don't know that much about superheroes, but this is just coming to mind. So I'm going to go with
Oh, well, you got a geek on the other side that's good,
it.
can
Oh,
help you
perfect.
out. Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
good.
All right. This is going to be, talk about shame. It's all going to come out right here. Yeah.
I love it. Okay. So Captain America, right, is if we say that Captain America is the trauma response, right? The trauma response is a set of adaptive mechanisms in your brain and body that are there to keep you alive. If we didn't have the trauma response, we wouldn't survive. So we need it. And his shield is the shame. So I think that they are like, so you asked, are they related? Like how are they the same? I think that they're almost one because Captain America isn't really Captain America without his shield.
They're
But
symbiotic.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. But shame, but the shield, now this is where the metaphor is going to fall apart, I think, or maybe not. I don't know. You tell me.
Let's see.
The shield is the thing that both protects and then gets in the way of healing. So we pull shame in as a defense mechanism. So it's the thing that stands between us and the rawness of the world that the trauma has just revealed, right?
Yeah.
Because what's underneath trauma is this idea that we now can't unsee the way that we are vulnerable in the world, which is a terrible thing. Okay, tell me, does this work?
You know what? You're just a hair's breadth, and this is where there's somebody screaming at their stereo in their car, right? Going, no, this is like total Iron Man is the better.
Oh, okay.
because
Okay.
he
Yes.
has the arc reactor in his chest
Yes.
that is
Okay.
keeping the shrapnel away from his heart, but
Oh,
also killing
yeah.
him at the same time.
Yes. Yes. And that's,
So
yes.
yeah, all right, there you go, everybody. Just outed myself. Huge MCU geek.
That's perfect because it also works because I always use Pepper Potts as the example of, people are like, what does the prefrontal cortex do? And it's like, it's Pepper Potts, right? She's super
Yeah.
organized. She's super rational. She's got the details down, working memory, all this stuff. So it kind of fits in. Thank you.
Oh, this is another podcast where we're going to completely dissect all these pathologies and we'll assign
Yes.
superheroes and villains to them.
Well, because all of the superheroes and all of the villains, I think we've
It's all
talked about this
based in,
before, maybe. Yeah, it's all based in trauma. They all have trauma.
they all have trauma. Yeah. There's
So
nobody. Yeah.
anyways, so the shame is the thing that I think like it's a coping mechanism. We think it's going to protect us. I know that
Yeah.
sounds irrational, but once we put it down, then we actually have to heal. I think it's the biggest boulder in the way of actual healing. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, after I came out on that podcast, I felt raw. I felt like I had
Mhm.
molted and it was, I could feel everything. And what was
Mhm.
hilarious is that, not hilarious, it was, tragically dark funny, is I didn't lose my job. I didn't lose my relationship. I didn't lose my
Right.
family. It was sort of like, well, what the hell's your problem? But I still felt, okay, this isn't a secret anymore. Like I just told you
Mhm.
before we came on, and I had a conversation with somebody, a professional conversation, where they wanted to employ my services or have me be a part from a coaching perspective. And they had listened to my podcast and they knew everything. And they were coming
Mhm.
with more information on me than I had on them. And that was
Yeah.
destabilizing. That was weird, which
Mhm.
is something that, tying back around to what we're talking about, is coming to a date with
Yeah.
social media in your back pocket and knowing that person
Oh
and being
yeah.
able to do a deep dive on them.
Mhm.
And that's another component to all this.
It's creepy.
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
I'm so glad you said the thing though about the kind of the weirdness of the world once you put down the shame and started really like sharing your story,
Yeah.
because I don't think we see it this way because we're so tempted to just put everything in a good or a bad box, right? Shame is bad, so we don't like it. But what
Yeah.
we miss then when we look at it that simply is that we get cozy with it.
Mhm.
And when we shake it off, it's uncomfortable. Like
Yeah.
you've spent your whole life expecting the world to react negatively and to tell you that you are bad because of who you love.
Yeah.
And so when you're met with when you're met with the person that walks away with their purse, it's going to sound so strange, but it's in a way comforting because it fits your story about
Yeah.
the world and
It does.
yourself.
It just tamped it down like gunpowder in a
Yeah.
cannon. It just
Yeah.
tamped it down. And as you were talking about that, it's very male. It's
Hmm.
sort of like, you need to be, the wounded gunslinger, like walking the
Yeah.
plains,
Yes.
just like, yeah, you
Yes.
need a backstory. You need some pain. You need
Yeah.
something that you have to muscle through.
Right.
And then when you don't, I mean, going one step further, when I started talking about suicide
Hmm.
ideation, that was almost more difficult because
Hmm.
that seemed elective. Like
Mm.
the sexual identity wasn't elective. That's just
Yeah.
who I
Yeah.
was. But
Yeah.
the other stuff
Right.
was, and then that's like, well, you just need to suck it up. You cracked. And,
Hmm.
and all the things that go like that. And I think that that's, that's the male part. That's the 21st century male. Like, no, man,
Buck
suck it
up.
up,
And
tamp
do
it
you know where
down.
that comes from? The history of the study of trauma. Because when we didn't understand what trauma was, pre 1800s, they assumed because so many people that were suffering with it and going to the doctor were females dealing with sexual assault. The whole field of psychology assumed that the only people that could suffer from trauma were women. And
Hmm.
because of the way they saw women at that time, to be traumatized was to be hysterical, was to be weak.
Hysterical.
And
Yeah.
then it was only into, I think it was World War I when people started finally realizing like, oh, men have this too. It's not tied to the literal uterus, but they kept that idea of weakness. And we still have that. Like I've done some work with veterans today where it's like, veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan war are still being called hysterical, female, weak, right? And we built like coping mechanisms around that, right? That whole thing of like, buck up. It doesn't just come from society. That was how clinicians treated soldiers.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
So
pejorative terms associated with female anatomy. I won't even say it,
exactly.
but yeah,
Right.
stuff like that. Yeah.
And they would literally, they would stand in a soldier's face. This is a clinician, Louis Yeeland. You can look up his case studies. He would stand in a soldier and scream obscenities about the soldier's mother to shock him out of his bad character. This was the practice. Wow. And we haven't shaken that off. And so we assume, both male and female, we assume that if we are suffering from trauma, what we are suffering from is weakness of will.
And in some cases, I mean, and it's not intentional, but your female partner will,
of course,
I need you to be strong for me. I need you to be,
yeah.
I need you to provide safety. And it doesn't even have to be explicitly demanded. It can be implicit. And it's like,
totally.
Okay, all right. That's probably another one early on in a relationship where it's like, yeah, I'll just keep this in the closet. Nobody needs to know that I'm fighting this.
Right, absolutely. Because I'm supposed to be the stoic, strong. This is how I will be attractive to this person. This will be how I garner their love and affection. Yeah, totally. And listen, like, it's not that we are all bad people. It's that we've grown up, we've come up in this system that views things in certain ways. And so we inherit and embody these beliefs that we don't ever think about critically. It's time to think critically, because we can undo that stuff.
And we can think critically as a new couple or going into a relationship, where you're willing to go.
Yep. And this thing of like, okay, so the question is like, how do you do this? How do you bring this into a relationship? Like, you're at the restaurant and you're like, okay, I've got this, let's pick a thing. What do we want to work with?
The sexual identity, kink, or something, something that's associated with shame. It's like, this is who I am. In order for this to work, it's got to be this.
Okay. And I've got this sexual identity, I've got this kink, I've got this thing that I'm ashamed of that I have to share. So how am I going to bring that in? One of the tools that I think is really helpful for reframing it as you're in the car on the way to the restaurant is to think about, what would the parallel be if you had a biological illness that this person needed to know about? So for example, I have celiac disease, which just means I can't eat gluten. Not really a big deal. I don't control it. I came this way. It's in my genes. Like, it is what it is. I might be like a little nervous about sharing that on a first date. Like, because the person's going to say, hey, do you want to share this bread and cheese platter?
Because he's a really hot baker.
Right. Okay, perfect. Okay. He's a hot baker and he's like, I brought you this bread. I made it with love. I'm so excited for you to try it. And now I have to say, oh, I'm so sorry, I have celiac disease, right? I'm going to feel something about that. Like, I'm going to wish all the way to the restaurant or his house or whatever that I didn't have celiac disease. But
damn
I do.
Your existence. You're going to come down and say, yeah.
Right. But I do. And I have to then say, I have celiac disease. I know that's inconvenient. That might be a deal breaker. You're a hot baker. What are we going to do about this? And I think like the important thing about that is that it's okay to feel feelings. It's okay to wish that you weren't that way a little bit, but it's a fact about you that shame doesn't make sense in the conversation. Like, I'm annoyed that I have celiac disease sometimes. And certainly in that case, I would be really inconvenienced by it because I also love bread, but I'm not going to be ashamed of who I am because I have celiac disease, right? Mm-hmm. We don't draw that parallel between the physical and the psychological, but I think that we should, because it helps us understand that it's scary and that some people might not react well, but that's on them. That's not about you. That hot baker might be like, you know what? Like, you're really great, but like, I don't really think I can be with someone that can't eat what I make.
Yeah.
Okay. That doesn't mean I have to now take apart my identity. It just means that what was true about me coming into the date is still true and that this isn't going to work.
And the morning after that, you make sure that you continue with your
Yes.
journey. And that's where integration comes in. That's where a
Yes. I
call
love
to
this.
support
Yes.
goes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this blew up on the launch pad last night. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like shit. I need to talk to somebody. I need to work this out. That is
Mm-hmm.
essential on this whole thing.
Yes. Yeah. 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 And you go to your friends and you go to your therapist and you go to, because I think the other last piece is that when we're doing this stuff, when we're dancing with all of our darkness, we need support systems, not a singular support person, right? We heal in community, we heal with therapy. Who can you talk to? Bring it to everyone you possibly can think of, because the more you have that conversation, the more integration will be possible. And we have to stop thinking that the only place we can talk about shame or trauma is in the therapist's office, because it's false.
Expand on that.
I mean, I think we're still doing, it's like a little remainder from the old bad understanding of trauma, that like it has to be secret. And the only place we can talk about it is in a dark room with our single therapist who will never say anything about it to anyone else. And I think we do a lot of like interesting cognitive work around that, like making it legitimate. Like, no, I'm just not trying to burden people. But what is true about healing is that it's an arc, it's a process, and we heal in 1,000 different ways, right? With people that know that we are trying to heal and people that we don't. You can have a healing interaction with the bus driver, right? You can have a healing interaction with your best friend or with someone in the supermarket who sees you crying in the ice cream aisle and says, "Hey, are you okay? You need anything?"
Yeah.
Right? Like it's not to be hidden. Healing is not to be hidden away.
Going back to the very thing we talked about is compassion.
Yeah.
For yourself and to somebody
Mm-hmm.
else.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good place to put a cap on this.
I didn't think, we started in all the darkness and then we're like, let's put a Mr. Rogers on it.
I
It's perfect.
guess. All right. But we're doing the MCU trauma on Smart Funny Tortured. I'm inspired now.
Oh, I love it.
But thank you. I see. Thank you
No,
for
thank you.
that. This was great. And where can everybody find you?
Oh, I'm on Instagram at MCPhD, EMSEY PhD. And I have a book coming out in March called Unbroken. The Trauma Response is Never Wrong, which is already available for pre-order anywhere that you buy books. How about you?
You can find all about me on smartfunnytorture.com. You can get hooked up with all the episodes of the podcast and all the information about how I coach. And that's it, smartfunnytorture.com.
And I will say that the podcast is fabulous. Do yourself a favor and go listen.
Thank you. And also yours. You got one
Oh, thank
upcoming.
you.
You've got yours too.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, you have a wonderful day, MC. Thank you
You
so
too.
much.
Thank you so much.
I hope that episode was helpful. Hey, listen, if you want to share your singlehood journey, if you've gone somewhere and come back, if you have revelations and wisdom, please share your story. It's going to help other people. Nothing makes us feel more connected than hearing other people's stories. So just send me the audio of your story, and you could just record it directly from your phone and email it to theangrytherapist@gmail.com. Also, if you want our Single on Purpose newsletter, go to singleonpurpose.life. That's singleonpurpose.life. You will get tools and articles and other people's stories, and also Zoom links to private gathers. So if you want to join our community, go to singleonpurpose.life. Thank you for listening. Be well. We hope you tell a friend.
Hello, my name is Brianna. I'm 26 years old, and I have been single on purpose for almost 3 weeks. So this previous relationship that I was in was 1.5 years, and it was insecure, and that's like a nice way of putting it. We were both very in love and willing to work on the relationship, but ultimately, his trauma was just like a lot to bear, to where he is an avoidant to the T, like textbook, and I'm anxious to the T textbook. And ultimately we just fed the cycle of the anxious avoidant dynamic, and our relationship ended. And this time it was for good. And so we were on like a cyclical thing where we would break up, not speak for like 2 weeks to a month, and then we would get back together with the intention of communicating better and using tools, reading books together, discussing them. But as soon as like I would bring up anything that was any type of concern, it would turn into a big fight, and then he would blame me for majority of our disagreements, and then it would turn into a shit show, basically. So now, this last time, not this last time that we broke up, but the time before when we broke up, I read Single on Purpose. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to be single. And then he like reeled me back in. My inner child took over and was like, oh, he'll love me this time correctly. And, so I got back with him, and then it lasted for about 3 months, and then we broke up. But I always had, like, this last time I was like, okay, this is the last time that I'm going to be in this cycle with you. I don't want to continue to break up and get back together. Like, if we're going to be together, we should be together. And then it didn't work out. And so now this podcast has come at the perfect timing. I'm also going to reread Single on Purpose just to get a refresher. And I'm realizing during this time, and I realized it in the past before, I feel like the universe is like, okay, Brianna, you need to be single. You need to learn to be by yourself. Because I've been in a relationship basically my entire life. So my first relationship was 14 to 18, so 4 years. And then we broke up. And then a couple months later, I met my other ex, and we dated from 18 to 25. And then we broke up in 2021. And then I met this current ex-partner 2 weeks later. Like, I wasted no time. And it was just, when I look back on it, a lot of love bombing, moving really fast. I was like so googly eye in love with him. And then it just went downhill from there. So the universe is just sitting there like, okay, like, are you ready to actually face these inner child issues, or are you going to keep repeating the same cycle? So I want the cycle to end here. I want to break generational curses, and I'm committed to doing that now. Like, I feel it's a work in progress, but I feel so much more in tune with myself. And I'm at a point where I would rather be alone than be with someone who doesn't honor my growth and honor my intuition and respect what I have to say. And so, I have about 6 more months left of nursing school. After that, I would like to move to Arizona. My soul has been telling me to go to Arizona for about 5 years now. And I just want to do things for myself this time. I feel like I've been trying to contort myself to fit into a man's life since I was 14. And before that, because I have had a past of, daddy issues, as they say. I don't really know if I like that term, but daddy issues. And so I'm tired of bending myself to fit into a man's life. Like, now I want to do things on my own terms. And one of those things is finding a nursing job in Arizona, and then work on getting my postpartum doula certification and just doing things for myself. So I'm excited to see what happens. And I thank you so much, you and Vanessa, so much for one, dropping this podcast, and also dropping y'all's book. I'm in the middle of it. I love it already. And I love how you said in the previous episode of this podcast that you're like, well, I better get to work so that I'm at the best version of myself for my future partner. And so that's what I'm doing. I know that one day I will find my partner, and we will both be willing and respectful, and it will click. And but for now, I'm not ready for that. It's time for me to date myself. And so, thank you so much. And thank you for listening.